Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa O'Brien, who is a Rice Academy Junior Fellow in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Rice University. Dr. O'Brien's research interests include collective behavior, communication, human and non-human communication, as well as movement ecology and behavioral ecology. She is developing cutting-edge sensor-based technologies to be collecting multimodal streams of data and the data analysis pipelines that are necessary to integrate all of this data and do her analyses. She has several research projects ongoing, which involve several species, including humans. And today her talk is titled Communication and the Coordination of Collective Behavior in Non-Human and Human Social Groups. Thank you very much for being here, braving the weather and all the technological challenges.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. This is also my first in-person talk in 2 years, so hopefully we all have a great experience back here together while we talk about collective behaviors. So today I'm going to be talking about my work that's at the intersection of communication and collective behavior, and which I've been tackling in a number of different species, and as Brian mentioned, developing new methods to study these topics. So group living can provide many benefits. In this video, a flock of starlings is evading a hawk, and it's displaying some of these benefits, such as reducing the likelihood of being preyed upon and gaining a greater ability to detect predators, even with less individual efforts and greater accuracy. So as you can see here, as the hawk is approaching the group, this group is responding very quickly to the changes in position, and the information on that position is rapidly spreading throughout the group. In other contexts, group living can provide additional benefits, such as increased access to social partners and mates, increased ability to find and defend resources, and improved decision making. In order to reap these benefits, group members must effectively organize their positions, behaviors, and activities, which can involve maintaining group cohesion, generating coordination, and making collective decisions. While traditional studies of animal behavior focus on the causes and consequences of individual behaviors, recent theoretical and technological developments have enabled great leaps in our understanding of collective behaviors. The field of collective behavior focuses on how the interactions of many individuals scale up to produce group-wide patterns of behavior. Studies focus mostly on decentralized interactions, with individuals behaving largely independently of their knowledge of their role within the group. The aim of many studies in the field of collective behavior is to understand the individual level rules that give rise to these collective behaviors, with the aim of quantitatively describing, reproducing, or predicting group-wide patterns. The majority of studies of collective behavior, particularly in the study of vertebrates, focus on the positions of group members. This is because position is a comparatively easy metric to measure, and it can reflect detailed, continuous information about group cohesion, coordination, and decision making.
Just need to check the screen sharing on Zoom.
Oh gosh. Uh-huh.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. Technical issue here. We just need to make sure the correct screen is shared.
I think if you go down to the bottom. Is it sharing anything?
No.
Oh, okay.
At all.
Right. Okay. Got it? Okay, great. All right. So advances in the field of collective behavior have been enhanced by the simplification of individuals and their interactions, since not all individual details are important with regards to the group-wide pattern. And studies demonstrate that simple local reactions to the behavior of others can result in complex and adaptive patterns of behavior on a group-wide level. For example, in order to generate coordination of movement, such as that seen in the videos that I've showed you so far, groups need to just follow some simple rules. So for example, individuals should move away from very near neighbors to avoid collision, adopt the same direction as those close by, and move towards neighbors who are too far away. Models based on these simple rules are capable of replicating and predicting many complex movement patterns that we see in the natural world, as well as in some of our own social groups. Particularly, these methods have been applied to the study of human crowds, since in these contexts, individuals are primarily responding to the positions of other group members. So conforming to the behaviors of neighbors may be effective under relatively simple conditions, such as groups exhibiting high levels of cohesion while evading predation. But quickly responding to the behaviors of neighbors may be logistically difficult or undesirable when trying to maintain coordination in the face of conflicting interests or information, or across activities or habitats that impair visual information on others' behaviors. So many of the simple rules used to explain group-wide patterns can break down in more complex habitats, or they're insufficient for explaining how individuals coordinate their behavior over long time frames. For example, complex landscapes can impede visibility in groups that are moving together in the wild. So for example, these are some goats. Might be difficult to see, but they're moving through this area where there's a lot of shrubbery around, and that can get in the way of visual information on where other group members are and what they're doing. In addition, other activities can distract visual attention from observing the behaviors of neighbors. So again, this is goats. I apologize if it's not showing up very well. The circle is focused on an individual who is in the shrubbery, focused on foraging, while the rest of his group has moved off into the background. So while it can be effective to be constantly responding to the behaviors of neighbors if you're trying to maintain cohesion, it's just not always feasible when you're trying to navigate other activities with your group. Also, in heterogeneous social groups, it can result in many differences between individuals. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
One more second.
Yep.
If you go down to here, we want to have right at the interfaces. So I go back to preferences.
Oh, yeah.
We need to have your video.
And then in the Zoom.
See, when she did that, it went to here, not to the.
Oh, do it. See if you can put your mouse up to the video. Right. Yeah. And then go up to the start video.
Yeah, start
Go
video.
back a little bit.
Okay.
And then.
Okay.
There we go. Let's see.
Okay.
We'll edit that out in post.
No problem. All right, so another example of situations that can increase the complexity of the ways in which individuals are organizing their behaviors is heterogeneous social groups, where individuals can differ in a lot of different variables, such as simply their gait, or their motivation, or their levels of information. So simple rules of movement coordination can break down in these contexts. So for example, if individuals are moving at different speeds, it may be difficult to keep up with other individuals in the group, or some individuals may have different preferences where they don't want to follow the lead of others in their group. So it remains poorly understood how organisms manage spacing, transfer information, and achieve coordination within complex social and ecological environments. So from a long history of animal communication research, we know that active communication, and particularly vocalizations, are useful for navigating contexts such as these due to their evolved ability to mediate social interactions and broadcast information within complex social and ecological environments. In particular, vocalizations have the potential to modulate group member behaviors by enhancing, modifying, or supplementing visual cues. So for example, vocal signals are capable of transmitting information or mediating social interactions when visual range is limited or when individual spacing is wide. Vocal signals can also increase one's ability to influence the behavior of receivers, for instance, by advertising personal information about the environment or one's motivational state. Also, communication can enable the negotiation of decisions or behaviors before any action is taken. Because of these abilities, considering the role communication plays in collective animal behavior may provide key insight into how organisms coordinate their activities in complex social and ecological environments. Also, since humans typically don't negotiate the majority of their group behaviors through movement cues, expanding the role of communication, expanding understanding of the role communication plays in collective behaviors also has the potential to facilitate understanding of human collective behaviors in broader contexts, such as during group collaboration. So my research is focused on understanding when and how communication is important for generating effective group-wide patterns. In the pursuit of these questions, I focus on a few sub-questions. So I study how social, ecological, and contextual variables impact individual signal production. I also study how receiver responses are impacted by signal production within specific social and ecological contexts. And most importantly, I study how the behaviors of many signalers and receivers scale up to generate patterns of group-wide behavior. So before I get into the rest of my talk, I'm going to provide a quick example of a study from my dissertation research that demonstrates a key role that vocalizations can play in mediating interactions in complex social and ecological environments, and also which sparked the direction of my current research. So my dissertation research focused on the foraging and food-associated calling behavior of chimpanzees, and was focused in a very traditional behavioral ecology. Chimpanzees sometimes produce food-associated rough grunt vocalizations upon discovery of food or while foraging. And many studies have examined the context in which these calls are produced. So for example, rough grunts are more likely to be produced when foraging on high-quality food, or when important social partners are in the vicinity, which supports hypotheses that these vocalizations can be used to facilitate co-feeding with group members. However, other studies have found that signalers produce these vocalizations more when they themselves are interested in feeding. They may also produce these vocalizations when higher-ranking individuals are in the vicinity. And they've also been found to be associated with the occurrence of aggressive events in feeding bouts. So there's potential that these calls may alternatively function to claim food for themselves or to communicate information with others in order to facilitate spacing while many individuals are coming together. So in order to better understand how these calls function from the perspective of the signaler, my research focused on how food-associated calls impact the behavior of receivers. Oh, sorry, that was an example of what these can sound like. So as part of this work, I conducted playback experiments with captive chimpanzees to determine the effect that food-associated calls have on the feeding site choices of listeners. So I familiarized the participants with the locations of two identical feeding sites, one on either side of a central waiting room, where they weren't able to see what was going on in these two rooms, but they were familiar with the locations and the identical quality of these food sources. So in addition to a silent trial, we presented participants with two types of playback trials. In the food-associated rough grunt condition, I presented individuals with a playback of rough grunt vocalizations randomly from one of the two food presentation rooms to determine how it would impact participants' decisions to approach either food patch. So if these vocalizations attract others, I would expect that participants would be more likely to first approach the room from which the food-associated calls were broadcast. However, if these vocalizations function by repelling others or increasing spacing while foraging, I expected that individuals would be more likely to approach the silent feeding site. I also conducted trials using control vocalizations to control for the perceived presence and vocal activity of given group members. So in the control call condition, I found that participants were equally likely to first approach the room from which the control call was broadcast, or the silent room. But in the rough grunt condition, I found that participants were significantly more likely to first approach the room from which rough grunts were broadcast, supporting the hypothesis that these vocalizations are attractive to receivers and may facilitate co-feeding with others. So my dissertation research demonstrates how vocal activity alone can impact individual movement behaviors and decision-making in foraging contexts. However, while calling to attract others may sound pretty straightforward, this is what food-associated calling behavior can look like and sound like in the wild. So you might be able to hear. It's a little quiet. But in contrast to situations where an individual finds food and gives a call and attracts others, these vocalizations are often produced in contexts when many individuals are coming together to feed, and there's lots of calling behavior going on between individuals. So while my dissertation research focused on food-associated calling behavior on an individual level, throughout my dissertation research, I became more and more interested in understanding the role that these calls play in group-wide behavior. I also understood how difficult it can be to disentangle the effects of many social and ecological variables in the behavior of groups in the wild. So in addition to gaining insight into the role vocalizations can play for individuals, I was left with many questions about the role they play in group-wide behaviors, which has led to my current research program. So my current research sits at the intersection of communication and collective behavior, because I think that they're both essential for understanding each other, particularly with vocalizations that play a key role in group-wide behaviors. So as I described in the introduction, considering communication may be important for understanding group-wide behaviors in complex environments, while at the same time, examining communication from the perspective of collective behavior has the potential to expand understanding of communication behaviors themselves. So especially those vocalizations involved in group-wide behaviors such as food-associated calls, contact calls, and alarm calls. So my proposal to combine these two areas of research was funded by the James S. McDonough Foundation postdoctoral fellowship in studying complex systems, and enabled me to spearhead this research area. So today I'm going to be covering 3 different studies focused on the intersection of communication and collective behavior. The first 2 sets of projects will focus on communication and collective movement in non-human social groups. So I'm going to be discussing the role that contact calls play in repairing group cohesion in domesticated herds, and also the role that grunt vocalizations play in the coordination of movement behavior in wild baboons. And then I'll end by discussing some of my current work focused on facilitating the role that patterns of vocal communication play in facilitating collective decision-making within human groups. So the first part of the talk will be focusing on my research approach to these 2 topics in non-human social groups. So this work was conducted in collaboration with my postdoctoral mentor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, Dr. Simone Garnier, my collaborator, Dr. Andrew King, and Dr. Guy Kalashaw. And it was funded by the James S. McDonough Foundation, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and the National Science Foundation. So in order to study collective behavior, it's essential to collect data on the behaviors of multiple group members simultaneously. And this is no simple task, especially when these groups are free-ranging. So this work has been facilitated by technology that enables the precise and continued tracking of individual position, both in the lab and in the field. For example, these images represent trajectories of fish on the left, humans in the center, and baboons on the right. So when I started out on my project, I wanted to combine communication with studies of collective movement, but no tracking devices with these capabilities were commercially available. So I developed in-house wearable data loggers with support from the Swansea Lab of Animal Movement. Their existing tracking devices consisted of GPS units and accelerometers and magnetometers. And for my project, I included audio recorders, which would allow me to collect continuous data on position, behavior, and vocal activity. So with these 3 devices, my data loggers are capable of collecting very detailed and continuous data on free-ranging individuals. The photo on the left shows an early version of one of these data loggers. It shows the flexible position of the microphone, which we originally included while we were testing out how best to put these collars together. The version on the right shows the inner workings of some of our later versions. All right. So the first 2 studies I'm going to be talking about were conducted at Salbis Nature Park in Namibia. Guy Kalishaw has been the director of the Salbis Baboon Project since the 1990s and has long-term data on the baboons in the park. There's a herd of domesticated goats and sheep that range the same environment, which enabled me to test the data loggers in the same environment in which we would be conducting the study of baboons, while also allowing me to spearhead this project on a relatively simpler system as I take steps towards this research area. All right, so this first study is focused on the role vocalizations play in repairing group cohesion in goat herds. So goats are a highly gregarious species, and they display coordinated herding behaviors. However, as can happen in complex landscapes, individuals can sometimes become separated from the herd. So during social separation, individuals have been found to display increased levels of movement and have higher heart rates. In these contexts, they also produce loud contact calls, which is one of their primary vocalization types. And this is an example of what one of those sound like. That one was loud. Oh gosh, okay. Now we have sound. So these calls have mostly been studied in the context of mother-infant interactions. It's been found that individuals will respond to the contact calls of either their offspring or their mother when they're played these vocalizations. However, these calls are also produced among adult group members, and less is known about whether or how these vocalizations modify group member behaviors in order to help repair group cohesion. Ooh. All right. So one of the first objectives of the project was to quantify the association between call production and changes in group spread, and then also to determine whether and how contact calls facilitate group contraction. So the study involved 16 adult female goats. I first separated these goats from a larger herd, and so I could put collars on all individuals in the group. So after I separated the group, I gave them 5 days to acclimate to their new social group, and then there were 10 days with the collars, which was also supplemented with observational data. The goats were free-ranging from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., during which the rest of the time they were within their pen. While they were out, they were allowed to go anywhere around the park that they wanted, but I did have to occasionally herd them to and from the pen at the beginning and end of the data collection period, and occasionally away from park boundaries, camp, and the larger herd. But these periods were documented and excluded from data analysis. So I'm going to briefly skim over data processing, even though it's actually a major step of collecting these continuous and detailed data sets, especially with regards to vocal communication. So we just have continuous recordings of these individuals during the data collection period. And so one of the key steps that needs to happen is detecting when vocalizations of interest are occurring. And so our approach in this project was to use a support vector machine that allowed us to detect vocalizations based on known vocalizations that I documented in the observational data, and also samples of verified background noise. And we focused on amplitude and fundamental frequency. These calls were relatively easy, especially compared to the baboons, in that they're very, very loud, as you could hear. And the microphone is very close to the sound source. And so largely these vocalizations are overpowering a lot of the other background noise that is happening. And so in order to associate the vocalizations with patterns of movement, we focused on a few key periods in the data. So when the group is free-ranging, when it's free from influence of the observers, which is the majority of the time, and also when the group is moving as a cohesive unit. So occasionally the group would break up into more than one group, and so we don't include those periods in data analysis. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to be focusing on a measure that's related to a distance to centroid. So in this example, these are some GPS trajectories of the goats in the different colors. And the white here is the centroid of the group. So it's the mean position of group members. And we are then able to measure the distance that each individual is from this mean location. And that's a reflection of group spread. And so I'm going to be referring to different measures related to this trait in some of the following slides. All right, so in our analyses, we needed to determine whether calls were produced more often in particular contexts or by particular individuals. But we needed comparable null models. So in order to generate these null models, we used randomization procedures to hold all variables constant except for the relationship that we were investigating. So for example, in the first analyses, I measured the maximum distance to centroid. So if you measure the distance to centroid of all group members at a given point in time, you find the individual that's the furthest, and you document that number. And we focused on that measure at the time of call production. And then I completed the same analysis, but relative to randomly selected time points. And then compare the distributions between these two data sets. So on the left, you see the randomized data collected during randomized time points, and the right is collected during periods where vocalizations were produced. So when you compare these distributions, you can determine when the real data is differing from the randomly selected data. So in the graph on the right, areas where the confidence interval do not overlap with the red line represent periods in the real data set, periods where the real data set is significantly different from the randomized data. So I found that call production by anyone in the group was significantly more likely than expected when the group had wider group spread, which is in line with expectations that these vocalizations are helping to facilitate the repair of cohesion in those contexts. So that was focused on whether anybody gave a call at a particular point in time. So next I wanted to focus on who was calling. All right, so I focused on the individual that produced the call in a given calling bout and measured its distance from the center of the group. And then I compared those data based on randomized data sets where I permutated the identity of the caller. So rather than the individual who actually gave the call, it was another randomly selected group member. So if you would expect that anyone would be likely to produce a call when group spread is wide, the real data would not look any different from the randomized data. But what we found is that the individual that actually gives the call is more likely to be further from the center of the group when it calls. So calls are being produced when group spread is wide, and the one that is doing the calling is most likely to be the one that's far away. I repeated the same analysis as I described in the previous set of graphs, but looking at their ranked distance. So are you the closest to the center of the group or the furthest center of the group? And I found that individuals that were the furthest from the center were the most likely to be producing these calls. So these results confirm that calls are associated with contexts of wide group spread. So then I investigated whether call production is correlated with the reestablishment of group cohesion. So this graph measures group spread over two different 6-hour periods. The y-axis reflects the maximum group member distance from the center of the group, and the x-axis is time. And the vertical dotted lines indicate instances in which one group member produced these contact calls. So as you can see, the calls tend to occur at peaks in group spread. And when you align the times of all of these vocalizations on top of one another and then find the mean calling rates relative to those time periods, it looks like this, where 0 here is the group spread at the time of call production. And so what you can see is that group spread was never significantly greater than it was at the time of the call. But group spread was significantly lower both before the call and after the call. So these results indicate that calls are associated with peaks in group spread, as well as its subsequent contraction. So next, I just wanted to clarify that even though calls were more likely to be produced when individuals were far away, many calls were still produced by individuals that were near the center of the group, simply because individuals spend more time in those locations. So if you see the real data set in the blue on the right, you see many calls that are actually by individuals that are close to the center. And so in some species and in mother-infant interactions, there's evidence that counter-calling can be important for regaining cohesion, where if somebody is, or an individual is far from the group, they may produce a vocalization that elicits another vocalization from an individual near the center that allows them to come back to the center of the group. But in our data, we had limited evidence that counter-calling plays a strong role in group contraction. So 78.9% of calling bouts were by a single vocalizer, while 21.1% were by multiple callers. But in those bouts with multiple callers, the second caller was equally likely to be closer to or further from the group. So it doesn't adhere to the expectation that an individual far from the group would call, which was responded to by individuals towards the center. So we had to focus on ways in which call production by a single individual could help facilitate regaining cohesion. So how do they do this? I focused on two primary hypotheses. So one is the vocal beacon hypothesis, where I produce a call and it tracks other group members towards me. Then there's also the straggler hypothesis, where calls may slow or stop group movement away from the signaler, enabling it to more readily catch up. So, and I tested these hypotheses separately for calls that were produced by individuals who were far from the center of the group at the time of call production, and those who were close to the center of the group. So to test my hypotheses, I focused on measuring group members' velocities relative to one another at the time of call production, as well as changes in velocity following call production. So I focused on the movement of the caller relative to the group and the group relative to the caller. So for the vocal beacon hypothesis, we'd expect that the individual that produces the call may be either moving neutrally relative to the group or even away, while call production triggers an attractive response from the group towards the caller. In contrast, the straggler hypothesis predicts that at the time of call production, the signaler is moving towards the group, trying to catch up, while the group is either moving neutrally or away. And then after call production, they slow their movement away from the signaler. All right. And so using our data, we were able to test these hypotheses to determine how these vocalizations might be altering group member behavior. Okay, so I'm going to have a couple of different graphs here that is showing group member velocities relative to one another over time. So I don't have the data here yet. On the x-axis is time relative to call production, where the call was produced at time 0. And the y-axis is velocity. So in this graph, it's the velocity of the caller, so the individual that gave the call, relative to other group members. So if you see data above this red line, it means they're moving towards the group. Data below the red line means they're moving away from the group. So when individuals far from the group produce vocalizations, this is what their behavior looks like. So we see this sharp peak in movement towards the group at the time of call production. The purple line is just the smoothed window. So we're going to do the same with the velocity of the group relative to the signaler, where data above the red line means that the group is moving towards the signaler, while data below the red line means that the group is moving away from the signaler. So what I found is that prior to call production, the group is beginning to move away And after call production, the group begins to lessen that movement away from the caller. So we were able to compare these periods of movement to how they are moving at the time of the call, and we found that after the time of the call, the group was moving less away from the individual that produced the call. So combining these two together, we see when individuals are far from the group, they produce a call which is associated with a rapid movement towards the group, while the group slows its movement away from the caller, which is in line with the straggler hypothesis. So this is a visualization of some of these data where the blue line right there is the individual producing the vocalization while trying to catch up with group members further ahead. So you can see that it's rapidly closing the distance there, and eventually the group is able to move off cohesively. Okay, but then we also focused on those individuals that are calling from the center of the group. So I'm going to go through the same sets of graphs, but this time the caller is in the middle of the group. So we found that call production by central vocalizers was associated with movement away from the group following call production, right here. Meanwhile, the group had significantly positive movement towards the caller following call production. So when individuals in the center of the group are producing these vocalizations, they're more likely to begin moving off, while individuals in the rest of the group begin moving towards that signaler. So this is an example of one such scenario. So you'll see the blue come up, and that's vocalizations. And you can see the rest of the group, particularly these individuals who are further away, begin moving towards where those vocalizations were produced. And so in this context, it actually supports the vocal beacon hypothesis, where individuals that are near the center of the group are able to use vocal signals to attract other group members towards themselves as a means of drawing group members back together. So a summary of these results are that calls are produced when group spread is wide, especially by distant individuals. Calls correlate with the cessation of group expansion and subsequent contraction. And calling increases group velocity relative to the caller, regardless of their position. So either by halting movement away from distant signalers or pulling the group towards central signalers. So these results, they demonstrate that considering call production provides a greater understanding of collective behaviors, particularly in complex environments. So for example, if you wanted to explain it simply by positional data, we could have fit some sort of elastic model to the data that explains how individuals will move wider apart and then come back together and kind of follow this cyclical motion. But it would not be able to describe the behavioral mechanisms that are facilitating this contraction. So it demonstrates that call production acts as an additional social force that can be selectively used to regulate group cohesion when it breaks down, which can be important, as I mentioned, in complex habitats where you have to balance other activities in maintaining group cohesion, or when visual information on others' behaviors may be limited. All right, so before I move forward, I wanted to briefly describe another study focused on the same data set that was led by my collaborator, Daniel Sankey, as part of his master's project. So this study demonstrates that while communication has the potential to provide benefits, it's not needed in all contexts. So there's evidence that in some species, individuals will vote on their movement direction. So this is a hypothesis that was put forth by studies of buffalo that's often perpetuated in the literature. So the idea is that individuals can use their body orientation as votes on their intended movement direction, where the group will then move off in the mean direction of group members' orientations. So we wanted to use this data set to one, developed methods to differentiate that hypothesis with the hypothesis that individuals might simply begin following the movement of an individual that starts to lead a change in direction. So we developed methods to measure this, the alignment of body orientation with movement direction. So on the left here, you'll see goats that are pointed in many different directions, and the brown arrow demonstrates the mean orientation of those individuals. The blue arrow represents just a theoretical direction that these goats might then move off in the direction of once they start to move. And so we developed a decision parameter that reflects the match between the mean goat orientation and this departure direction. So if they are one and the same, it means that the group is moving off in, that the orientations are focused on the direction that they are moving off in. Right, so this top graph here is just showing group speed over time at the onset of group moves. So we have low groups here, low speed here during resting periods, followed by this sharp increase in speed at which the group is traveling. This is just a theoretical demonstration of what speed can look like during transitions between rest and movement. And we also developed a theoretical model on what the decision parameter would look like in a few different scenarios. So remember, the decision parameter is the alignment between the mean goat orientation and the group's subsequent direction. So if goats are voting on their direction of travel with their body orientation, we would expect that that would come in alignment with their direction of subsequent travel prior to movement. So you'd see this increase in the value of the decision parameter before movement begins in that purple line there. On the other hand, if we focus on this dotted blue line, that's a scenario in which one or a subset of individuals just start moving off, and the group conforms to that movement direction as the group is kind of building speed. So in that scenario, individuals are just following the lead of other group members without this formal signaling process, while the green line in the middle is focused on just voting by a subgroup of individuals prior to group move, which is kind of an in-between scenario. And so we wanted to compare these models to our actual data to see what it looks like for goats as they're beginning to move off. Up here is just showing the alignment of the speed data relative to the timing of movement onset, where we see the group is relatively stationary here, followed by a rapid increase in speed, which they begin traveling after that period. So that's the periods in which the group is beginning to move off. And when we look at the decision parameter, we see that the data adheres to this blue line on the left-hand side right here, which indicates that as the group is beginning to move off, that's when the group starts pointing towards their future movement direction. So they're not pointing towards it prior to moving. They are all starting to move once an individual begins moving off and the group starts gaining speed. So from this study, we did not find evidence that body orientation indicates intended movement direction by pointing towards the direction they want to go before they move, but rather the group follows leaders as they begin to move off, and they conform with that direction of travel. So just to clarify, communication isn't always needed. The studies demonstrates that while communication can be beneficial for example, expressing motivations, there can be some costs that must be considered when thinking about communication, such as slower decision-making, increased energy expenditure, or increasing conspicuousness to predators. So communication might not always be needed in every context. So an important research question is when and why is communication used in some social and ecological contexts, or in some species and not in others. So this provides a good segue into a more complex social and communicative system of chacma baboons. So while the goats primarily produce vocalizations in contexts where group spread is wide, baboons can produce many different vocalizations that have a wide variety of functions, and many of these are in the context of group movements. So the aim of this project is to examine how vocalization shape the coordination of collective movement behavior in baboons. So Chacma baboons live in large multi-male, multi-female troops. They display female phyllopatrhy, where females will remain in their natal community and male transfer. The troop spreads out while traveling and foraging during the day, but they remain cohesive, and they all sleep together tonight in the same location. So while baboons produce a variety of vocalizations, one of their most common is the grunt, which is shown in the spectrogram here. And I'll play an example of what that can sound like. So grunts are soft, harmonically rich vocalizations, and they've been found to be individually distinctive. They're also produced in a variety of contexts, such as during social interactions, in the context of group moves, and while traveling and foraging. And so these are vocalizations in contrast to the loud contact calls that you heard with the goats. These are more close-range vocalizations, and they're produced much more frequently as individuals are interacting with one another and moving across the landscape. All right. So some vocalizations produced in movement contexts are hypothesized to play a role in coordinating the timing of group departure. So as I talked about with the goats, that was the hypothesis that visual signals may coordinate the direction of a group departure. There are pre-departure signals that are thought to control departure timing. So these vocalizations are thought to convey a readiness to depart, where if an individual were to initiate a move, the group would be more likely to follow, especially when many group members are producing these vocalizations. So there's a hypothesis that once the level of signaling in a group reaches a certain level, that the group is more likely to initiate a transition in behavior. And this is supported by many studies. So in a study of African wild dogs, sneeze vocalizations are produced prior to successful departures. In this blue line here, where the timing of departure is here, indicating that these vocalizations are related to the initiation of successful movement. While in situations where an individual tried to initiate a movement, but the other group members did not follow, that's indicated by this orange line here. And as you can see, in those contexts where an initiator was unsuccessful, the grunting behavior the sneezing behavior of other group members was not very high, which may indicate that the group was just not ready to leave at that point. All right. But in Chacma baboons, so they produce these vocalizations in the context of pre-departure periods and also while moving. And some playback experiments have found that playbacks of grunts in movement contexts can elicit grunts by others and also visual orientation towards future movement direction. But a study of baboons actually at the field site where I conducted the following work, grunt rate did not predict successful departure. So individuals in that study were found to be more likely to follow the initiation behavior of individuals they have strong relationships with. But the grunt rate prior to that point was not related to whether or not a group movement proceeded. So in my current study, I'm re-examining the role that grunts play in movement contexts by obtaining more detailed and continuous data on the relationship between calling and movement behaviors to better understand the role that they may play in coordinating movement. So my central research question is, do grunts play a role in the coordination of collective departure? And if so, how? My first hypothesis is that grunts do serve as pre-departure signals where group-wide grunting behavior facilitates decisions regarding the timing of group movement initiation. So for this hypothesis, you would expect to see an increase in grunting behavior prior to a group move, and then it would decrease after that as the group begins to move off. Another hypothesis is that grunts may serve as a type of movement call, where grunts may influence the direction of departure, or they may help to maintain contact with individuals with other group members as they are beginning to move off. And so in this case, you might expect calling to increase as the group begins to depart and move out into the landscape. So in order to examine the relationship between the timing of this grunting behavior and movement onset, I used similar methods as I described in the goat study, where I used data loggers with continuous GPS, acceleration, and audio. I was able to fit them on 9 adult wild baboons, which represented 60% of the adults. So we're not able to collar all adults, but we were able to tag a majority of them. The study took place over 30 days at Salvas Nature Park in Namibia. However, the audio data from these devices only lasted 10 days, which is one of the shortcomings of these methods is that these devices can be very battery intensive. And so that's one area that can require a lot of development in order to collect data over longer periods. All right. So again, I'm going to only briefly touch base on how we processed these data, which was a very significant step in this process, or in this project. So to test our hypotheses, we needed to know when these vocalizations were given and extract grunts from continuous audio recordings. So to do this, we trained a deep neural network to differentiate between verified grunts and other vocalizations in background noise. When tested against our validation data set, we had a 98% success rate in detecting these grunts. To estimate the timing of departure, we used change point analysis to detect significant changes in both group spread and the directedness of movement. So how autocorrelated in time the GPS trajectories were. For our study, we only focused on those movement periods that last at least 10 minutes and have at least 20 minutes of rest prior to the onset of movement. So this is an example of what these data look like. This is one full day of baboon trajectory where they began on this sleeping cliff here. They moved off in this direction at the beginning of the day and traveled around the park and then eventually ended up and slept right back at the same place that they started, where each of these cyan points here are the locations in which a baboon gave a grunt vocalization. Before I show this graph, okay. So on the next page, I'm going to show some data that we have very recently put together, which was a long time coming given the intensive amount of data processing that's involved in this project. But what we did is we extracted all of these grunts and we focused on the onset of movement that we were able to detect from the GPS data. And then similar to the goats, we looked at group member behavior on either side of those periods, but this time we were looking at calling behavior relative to the onset of movement. And so we focused on the onset of group movement at each of the time points that we detected, and we found mean call rate over time relative to that period. And that is what is shown here. So this is a sliding window of mean call rate over time in blue, with this being the confidence interval. Time 0 is the time of group movement onset. And so you can see at the time of movement onset, we're actually seeing an increase in grunting behavior after the group has started to move off. And if we compare this to what we would see if we calculated mean call rate relative to randomly selected time points, it looks like this in gray, where the black line represents mean call rate relative to randomly selected time points when the group was not necessarily beginning to move. So you can see there's a lot of overlap here between the blue and the black lines while they begin to move apart after movement onset, showing that grunting behavior is increased relative to baseline after movement onset has begun. But you also see that there are very wide confidence intervals here, which shows that there is variation across these bouts. And so what we did is we, excuse me, we fit linear models to these data to better understand how call rate is changing over time relative to movement, as well as how it may be impacted by other variables such as time of day. And the output of this model is represented here. So on this panel here is representing data before group movement. Movement will occur in between these two panels, and then this is representing periods following group movement. While the y-axis is the likelihood that any individual produces a grunt. So what we have found is that call production increases more over time before movement onset rather than after. So we do see, particularly in early movement bouts, that calling behavior is increasing, while we don't necessarily see that increase after movement. However, call production overall is significantly greater after movement than before. And another thing we found is that call production increases over time more during early movement periods. So that's these red lines versus these blue lines here, which are later movement periods. So we're seeing a lot of different things here. One is that we are seeing some evidence of this increase in grunting behavior prior to departure, but overall, grunting is greater as the group is actually beginning to move off. But overall, grunting behavior is seen more in these early movement periods, which may correspond to situations where individuals are on their sleeping cliff trying to decide on the direction that they're going to be moving for the rest of the day. So my previous analysis focused on call production relative to the timing of group departure, which was calculated by focusing on the group centroid. However, individuals can begin to move prior to this point or after this point. So I'm currently in the process of testing whether the increase in call production we see prior to group movement is due to calls produced by individuals that are starting to move before the group, or whether it's reflecting individuals that are producing these calls and then deciding to move. So in order to differentiate between these alternatives, I've been working on calculating the rate of call production as detected by the data logger worn by each specific individual relative to their own time of departure. I'm going to display some preliminary results that are focused only on the early departures, their first move of the day, and we're currently working on expanding these analyses to additional movement periods during the day. So what this shows is this is call rate of the individual wearing the data logger relative to the time of its own movement at time 0. This is aggregated across group members. There's actually there's wide variation in call production. The reason that we're seeing these baselines of 0 here is that there's not a consistent pattern of call production prior to departure. And so the median call rate during those time periods is very low. But what we're seeing is that just after an individual begins to depart, their own calling behavior is more likely to be higher, which provides tentative evidence that individuals are starting to depart and then starting to produce these vocalizations. So summary of our findings are that we're seeing an increase in grunt production prior to group moves, but grunting is actually highest after departure. And we see preliminary evidence that individuals begin producing calls after they start to move off. And also, we found that grunting may play a stronger role during earlier group movement periods. So these results indicate that grunts are they may be important for understanding these movement contexts, but more work needs to be done to understand what specific role that they are playing here. So, as I mentioned before, I'm currently working to expand analyses looking at the alignment between an individual's own call production and the timing of its own movement to clarify how grunting is relating to an individual's own movement behaviors. So you're seeing a visualization of one of these contexts where group members are on the side of the riverbed and an individual begins to move off. And as it does, you start to see these grunting behaviors in the blue. So we're interested in examining this on an individual level to better understand how the aggregated patterns that we looked at before are generated from the movements of individuals. And then also, overall, we are finding that grunting behavior is higher once individuals have actually started to move. And so we're going to be examining what role these grunts actually play in these contexts. So what role are they playing, if any, in the coordination of this movement behavior? Okay. So that has been a lot of information. I am now going on to my current project. Do we still have time?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. All right. So I have been focusing on coordination and communication in non-human social groups. But I'm going to switch gears now and talk about human social groups. So my work on group communication, coordination, and decision-making in animal groups has progressively motivated me to study comparable questions in human groups. So there's a lot of overlap between these research areas, particularly because studies of movement is really a way of looking at decision-making and coordination in a way that can be measured and studied continuously over time. And so there's a lot of overlap with studies of those topics in human groups. And so while continuing to work with the data sets that I described previously, I've been also working to broaden my perspective on communication and collective behaviors by studying these topics in human teams, which have to effectively organize their behavior in order to achieve successful group outcomes. So humans don't really move around in little pods to coordinate, but in the context of teamwork, they are working together with one another to try to achieve these group-wide outcomes. So this topic is focused on the idea of collective intelligence. So collective intelligence is defined as intelligence that involves group rather than individual mental effort. In contrast to overall performance, the term collective intelligence describes the increase in effectiveness that team members gain by working together. So for example, a team of poorer performers could display high collective intelligence if they perform better than they could on their own, while a team of high performers may display low collective intelligence when they don't gain much by working together. So how team members combine their cognitive resources may be just as or even more important to the emergence of collective intelligence than their cognitive resources themselves. In the process of exchanging ideas, coordinating behaviors, and decision-making, group conversations can also have complex collective dynamics. So during a conversation, an individual's speaking behaviors both shape and react to the behavior of other individuals. For example, this is a visualization of an actual conversation between 3 speakers, where each colored bar is representing the timing and duration of their individual speaking turns. So this coordinated process is shaped by both the implicit rules of conversational turn taking. So for example, there is little overlap between these speaking turns. And it can also be shaped by individual variation in speaking behaviors. So for example, individual traits can shape speaking behaviors, such as dominance or sex. So for example, dominance level has been found to correlate with total speaking time and the likelihood of interruption. And in mixed sex pairs, men talk more than women, regardless of relative dominance in one study. So team members' communication behaviors may combine in complex ways to shape the structure of interactions between them, which can then shape how their contributions are converted into team outputs. So there is evidence that communication dynamics can play an important role in team performance and collective intelligence, even independent of the content of these interactions. So for example, total speaking time is found to connect to perceived leadership. Unequal speaking time across group members can negatively correlate with team outcomes. And the centralization of speaking around dominant team members has been found to negatively impact the skill utilization of the other team members. So studying the structure of communication processes, even with no or minimal content, has the potential to shed light on important interaction mechanisms underlying the emergence of collective intelligence. So one of my key research questions on this topic is, how does communication aid the conversion of individual ideas to team outcomes? And because of my background, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of collective behavior. So when we're thinking about the, about the animal groups, we have them positioned in physical space, so in latitude and longitude, where individuals might start out in different positions, and through their interactions with one another, they end up at a final destination. So in animals, this is a type of group decision-making where they're able to influence the decisions of one another in order to come to consensus on a particular direction of travel. So I like to think about this in the context of teamwork in a similar way, but abstracted into conceptual space, where individuals might start out with different ideas or opinions, where they might be positioned here in conceptual space at different areas, but then they have this interaction period over time, which often involves conversation with one another, and then ultimately will result in a team outcome. So it can be performance on a particular challenge, or it could be decision-making or behavioral coordination. So to study this topic, I've been taking inspiration from the study of animal swarm intelligence to develop ways of measuring these processes over time in order to relate them to patterns of communication between individuals, to better understand how these patterns of communication are aiding the conversion of these individual inputs into these group-wide outputs. I'm collaborating with a multidisciplinary team of researchers in the areas of psychological sciences and engineering. And many of our projects are focused on the engineering design process. Funding for this project is provided by Rice University, the National Science Foundation, and Microsoft. So our team is developing and using remote sensing technology to continuously measure verbal and nonverbal behaviors throughout the teamwork process during both observational studies of real-world teams and experiments in the lab. Unfortunately, the past few years have not been the best time to be studying in-person social interactions. So we had to shift our studies towards the study of virtual teams, both in the lab and in real-world student groups. All right. We have evidence that patterns of communication can be important in the perceptions of team members. So in studies of some of our real-world teams interacting virtually over semester-long student projects, we found that individuals who speak more are rated more highly by their other team members. And also team member pairs that will have higher mutual ratings of one another if they interact with one another more frequently. So while this study is focused on the relationship between objective measures and teamwork perceptions, I'm ultimately interested in how these interactions shape team outcomes. So I conducted experiments with virtual teams of undergraduates as a first step towards examining the role communication plays in the emergence of collective intelligence. So the task we used for this study is a game called LineWriter. And LineWriter is a simple online design tool that lets users draw lines which a virtual sled rider can sled down. So we use this platform to design an obstacle course where participants are challenged to draw one line that will maximize their score within this course. This is an example of a course where the goal was for the rider to make it from the top left corner, right here, this is the rider here, to the bottom right corner as quickly as possible, while also passing through as many points as possible and avoiding the squares. And this is an example of what one such solution could look like, where the sled rider would sled down here and end up in the final box on the bottom right. And the performance outcome for the courses were a combined metric reflecting both speed and the number of points that the line passes through. So the structure of this task is that we had both an individual phase where individuals worked completely on their own, or we had a teamwork phase where we had teams of 3 working together. But in both conditions, we had an individual phase where everybody worked independently. So individuals had 10 minutes to brainstorm their own idea, where they would physically draw their idea and send it to the experimenters. Excuse me. And then there was a final decision-making phase. And this looked different in the two different conditions. So in individual trials, individuals would produce their brainstorming idea, and then in the final phase, they would just have more time to work on their idea. So they would, again, start from scratch, but they could produce the same idea, or they could develop it further during a period of 15 minutes. In team trials, similar to the individual trials, we had the brainstorming phase where individuals worked independently to come up with their brainstorming idea, and then a final phase where they worked together with one another for 15 minutes and had to come up with a final team outcome. And since we were using Zoom to record these interactions and for them to work with one another, they did this by working together on the facilitator's screen. So they used the request remote control option in order to draw on the screen and produce the outcome together. And I'm mentioning this now because it does become relevant later on in the study. All right, so using this framework, I'm studying how conversation aids the conversion of individual ideas to team solutions. And as a first step in this process, I'm focusing on where individuals start out, so their brainstorming ideas, and where they end up, so the group's final idea. And right now, I'm relating that to just summaries of speaking behavior, so overall speaking time. Ultimately, I would like to look at this more continuously over time. So this is an example what some of the data sets can look like, where the colored lines, the three colored lines here, are the different brainstorming ideas of individuals in the team. And the black line here is what the team ultimately comes up with for their final idea. And so what we're able to do is then measure the differences between the team idea and the individual ideas to determine which individual had a stronger impact on the team final product. And then we can relate that to different traits of the individuals. So my interest is how conversation, the role that communication plays in converting these individual ideas into team outcomes. So is it the case that individuals who spend more time speaking and potentially sharing their ideas with others, that they are more likely to shape the group idea towards their own? Or may this be impacted more by the quality of the idea or individual traits such as dominance level? So first, I wanted to see whether teams are actually displaying collective intelligence by comparing outcomes to the individual phases. What I found is that in the individual condition, which are here, this is the initial phase and this is the final phase, there were no performance differences between these two phases. So when individuals were given more time to work on their design, they ultimately did not perform better or worse. Also, when we compare the designs of the individual phase in both the individual and team condition, where everybody is working independently, we did not have any differences across those two conditions in their initial brainstorming ideas. However, when we compare the outcomes of the final phase, we see that teams performed significantly better in this final phase when they were working together than when individuals continued to work on this problem on their own. And we can also look at this within teams by comparing the performance of the team outcome to the performance of the initial ideas of their team members. They found that teams performed significantly better than their worst brainstorming idea. They performed significantly better than their median brainstorming idea. But they actually performed worse than their best brainstorming idea. But still, team members were able to perform better than they would had they continued to work on their own. All right, so this is showing again what we're able to do with this data set by measuring the differences between the team product and the individual contributions of the team members. And we're able to measure the distances between these tracks. So over here we see that the purple line is the closest to the group line in red. So we see a comparable, a lower distance measure. The units are arbitrary here, whereas we see the green and the blue lines are much further from this red group line. And so we're able to use this as a measure of how much influence these initial ideas had on the ultimate group outcome. So what I've found so far is that within teams, an individual's brainstorming idea had greater influence over the final group track, actually when they controlled the screen more. So this was not related to their speaking time, their dominance level, or the quality of their idea. So I mentioned screen control before, and this is a situation where individuals can grab control of the facilitator screen and physically draw their idea. And we found that the longer individuals spent doing this within their teams was correlated with those individuals basically shaping the team's idea towards their original idea. So they're kind of physically taking control of this team outcome. And we actually did not find that who took control of the screen was correlated with any other variables, although females were marginally less likely to control the screen. And while speaking time did not significantly correlate with the level of influence a team member had over the final design, screen control was positively correlated with speaking. So while screen control and physically reproducing designs was the main way in which individuals were shaping these team outcomes, they were also speaking more during these periods. So I'm just going to provide an overview of what some of these teams look like. So we can have situations where an individual may grab control of the screen, and they may or may not have the best idea in the group. But then we can have situations where the individual that grabs control of the screen is the one that has the best idea in the group. Or we have situations where another individual who's not controlling the screen has the best idea, and they are the ones that are shaping the team outcome. And so in order to do this, I compared the distances of the brainstorming tracks to the final team track between the individual that controlled the screen the most and the individual that had the best team solution. And data points that you'll see in this area here will mean that those are teams where the individual that controlled the screen more had the larger influence on the team outcome, while individuals in this space down here were those where the individual with the best solution had the best team outcome. And those on that line are situations in which the individual controlling the screen was also the individual with the best team outcome. And this is what we see. So approximately 2/3 of the teams were influenced most by the best design. So this is where sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, so this is situations where individuals either had the best solution and they didn't control the screen, or situations where they had the best solution and they controlled the screen. But in approximately 1/3 of those cases, these teams up here, individuals who controlled the screen had the most level of influence, even though they didn't have the best ideas. And we find that the further the team design is from the best brainstorming idea, the worse the team performs. So it's not the case that individuals are grabbing the screen and producing some new and improved version. If individuals are deviating from the best idea, they tend to do worse. So in summary, we're finding that teams are performing better than individuals, but they are performing worse than the best individual. Team members who physically take charge have the most influence, and they also do speak more in the process. And individuals who take charge don't always have the best ideas. And teams that land further from their best idea tend to perform worse. surprisingly, we also looked at perceptions of leadership, and we found that, well, not surprisingly, leadership was positively correlated with the amount of time a given individual was physically directing the team towards their team outcome by controlling the screen. But actually, the stronger predictor was speaking time. So individuals that had very low levels of speaking were very unlikely to be voted as the leader of the team, whereas individuals that had very high levels of speaking were more likely to be voted as the leader. So even though speaking time didn't come out as a strong variable in shaping the team ideas towards their own brainstorming idea, it still does appear to, at least in terms of perceptions, be related to this teamwork process. So in summary, again, so we're finding that this is a situation where physically taking charge and speaking time can correspond with leadership perspectives or perceptions. So as in the case with the goats, when they were starting to move off, individuals were actually physically directing the team in the direction they wanted to go to, which is comparable to what we're seeing here, where individuals are physically directing the team towards their own idea. And it's less clear so far what role speaking behaviors are playing in this process. So shortcomings are that we currently only have summaries of speaking time, and we know only the starting and ending places of the individuals and the team. So my goal for this project is to ultimately take it where we can connect the continuous speaking behaviors over time to the progression of the team outcome as team members are developing it. All right, so in conclusion, I've shown you many studies that are demonstrating both the important role that communication can play in organizing the behavior of group members, but also demonstrating some situations where communication might not play as central of a role as it might seem. And so what's important going forward is determining what contexts are important for understanding these group behaviors from the perspective of communication, while also increasing understanding of these collective behaviors by providing more ecological validity and understanding the behaviors that can allow individuals to interact over these complex situations. So by continuing to conduct studies with animal groups and human groups, I hope to continue to exchange ideas between these fields and help to inspire new hypotheses in both areas that can allow me to tease apart the ways in which the individual behaviors of groups might be coming together to shape these team outcomes. So just going to jump ahead and say thank you to my many collaborators, and I know it's late, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to talk now or later on today.
Thank you very much. So we are hitting the usual end for prep, but I think maybe we could have one or two questions, and then subsequently we'll be going and having coffee so we can carry on elsewhere. But if anyone has a question for Lisa, they could just go for it. And yes.
Yeah. Just a quick question about how do you define communication? Because with the goats, you said that communication might not always be necessary, but direction, like directing their body in a particular way, is of course a type of communication. So it's just not vocal communication.
Yeah, so there can be visual signals where a particular behavior has evolved specifically due to the effect it has on others. So to adjust others' behavior in a way that is beneficial to themselves, whereas there's other situations where an individual might produce a behavior that they would produce in any other context. So for instance, they might run away when they detect a predator simply because they're trying to get away from the predator, but at the same time that can be a type of visual cue that still provides information to others, but is not considered a signal that evolved for that purpose. So when I say communication, I don't mean that information is not being conveyed, but rather that it's not a behavior that evolved specifically to be sharing that information with others.
Right, but I think, I mean, the example with the direction that could be understood as an intentional signal.
With the
Which doesn't
goats
have
where
any
they
other
were.
function other than signaling to other group members too.
Well, so what we were looking at trying to use our data set to test hypotheses that the visual orientation or the physical orientation may be a signal of direction. Goats are automatically going to be positioned in any direction at any point in time. So the behaviors that we were measuring are just their direction that they were facing prior to moving. They may be foraging, they may be resting. It's just whatever direction they were facing at that time. It's not that they were standing there specifically like pointing in a direction. And what we found is that the individuals start to shift and move off as the group starts moving. They weren't sitting there providing a signal of their intended direction prior to the move in which the group then moved off in the direction that was being signaled about.
Okay. Yeah.
So that could serve as a signal in other systems if there is evidence for that. And what we found with the goats is that it was not serving that purpose.
More broadly, I would be interested in how vision would be related to vocalization.
Mm-hmm.
So that was both for the goats, but also for the baboons. Like, in what way is visual access to the individual or
Yeah.
to the group a predictor for the calls? Or not?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that we can do with this data set is, for example, relate the location of vocalizations to differences in habitat. So we can see whether vocalizations are more likely to happen when, for instance, there's denser habitat. So we have an aerial map of the landscape, and so we can actually pinpoint these vocalizations to where they're taking place. And we can test initially just to see whether or not these vocalizations are happening more when visual cues might be more limited. And eventually we could, for example, develop networks where we determine approximately who an individual might be able to see and see whether vocalizations are more likely in those contexts.
But very fascinating research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question about the loudness of the grunts. The kind of the grunts are pretty quiet,
Yeah.
and they're all being heard by maybe like a few neighboring baboons, whereas like the goats, like obviously like a broadcast where anyone can hear. And I guess also similarly to Dan's question about like just design of these signals and why they might appear the way they do. I guess I was wondering what do you think is happening with the grunts? Like, is it just they coordinate movement with their closest neighbors and then somehow that has some collective outcome, or like what's the purpose of them being so quiet?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, with the grunts, it's not a situation where an individual can produce a grunt and it's going to be heard by the whole group. It's just not loud enough for that. But grunts can still be impacting the behavior of surrounding individuals, which if many individuals are giving grunts, because they do give them around the same times, that can be shifting group behavior in kind of a more diffuse way, where my grunt is shifting your behavior and their grunt is shifting yours, and it's still kind of shaping the group outcome rather than having this like global effect on the group as a whole. But yes, one of the difficulties with grunts, and what is actually what draws me to vocalizations such as these, is that there's often not much happening when they give them. So they can give them when they're approaching individuals during social interactions, but often they're just sitting there, maybe foraging or grooming, and they'll just give a grunt. And nothing usually perceivable is changing, but they're giving them a lot. And so trying to understand what these grunts are doing is just like really, really intriguing to me, but also difficult, and why I'm approaching it in this way, to see if we look at this on a group-wide level, if we can determine how subtle shifts in behavior might be occurring in response to these grunts and shaping the group outcome.
Maybe one more question, and then we can call it a day. Renee?
Hi, thanks so much for this talk, and I love your visualization. Very cool. I was wondering how in the last study you measured dominance level, and also whether variation in dominance level between team members had an effect on the group outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't mention that before the study, we conducted surveys of team members of their personality traits and other attributes that we then can relate to some of these behaviors. So we used the big 5 personality traits as well as a subcomponent of dominance in these questionnaires to measure their level of dominance, and I did not find any role for dominance in these interactions. So one possibility for this is that these were very controlled situations. So group members are interacting over a relatively short time period, and they have a very focused objective, and in those types of contexts, personality doesn't always emerge. And so that may be one reason why we didn't find that. We are studying teams that are more in the wild, where they're interacting over the course of semesters. We collected Zoom data from team members, which I presented a bit of it there, where it's more likely that personality traits may come out over time. But we didn't see an effect in our study.
So to clarify, you did find that, if I'm correct, you did find that dominance level was associated with speaking time, or?
No, I actually didn't. Yeah, I didn't
Oh,
find
sorry, okay.
correlation with dominance for any of the behaviors.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk.